It's a huge honour to introduce our next guest. We believe at Research Ed that everybody who's a participant within the educational ecosystem, as I keep calling it, has a valuable opinion and something to say about research. Possibly none more so than people involved in policy making, where research and utility and ambitions coincide and often intersect. It is a great delight for me to say that we've got the Minister for Schools, Nick Gibb, who's agreed to speak to us. Thank you very much, Nick Gibb.
Ladies and gentlemen, behaviours are. It is a real privilege to be attending an event attended by over 700 teachers, all spending their first week, the first weekend of a new term, educating themselves about classroom practice. I just wonder why you haven't got other things to do back in school, but it's very good that there is this enthusiasm to be participating in a conference of teachers with so much potential to transform this country's educational landscape. In 1999, Douglas Carnine, a professor of education at the University of Oregon, wrote a short but pungent paper entitled "Why Education Experts Resist Effective Practices." And Carnine was and still is a strong advocate of direct instruction. He was frustrated at the education profession's unwillingness to acknowledge the empirical evidence in favour of teacher-led classrooms. And Carnine wrote that a defining feature of a mature profession, for example medicine or law, was a willingness to engage with research findings. And since I became a Shadow Minister for Schools in 2005, I've seen the teaching profession make strides towards Carnine's ideal of a mature profession. And no event indicates this better than Research Ed. Now in its third year and crossing 3 continents, Research Ed is a remarkable example of a grassroots movement, driven not by worthies on high, but by teachers on the ground, united by a desire to know how they can improve outcomes for their pupils. Tom Bennett created Research Ed, but central government can take some small claim for having provided the spark. In 2013, the government invited Ben Goldacre to write a report explaining how the education sector could make better use of evidence. And we were shocked by Goldacre's exposure of unevidenced practices in his book, Bad Science, exemplified by now legendary pseudoscience of brain gym. And I hope that we've all been rubbing our brain buttons in anticipation of today's conference. The Goldacre report was published by the DfE in March 2013, and it promoted a huge amount of discussion. And following a Twitter conversation involving Ben Goldacre, the gauntlet was thrown down in the direction of Tom Bennett. Can you organise a grassroots movement amongst teachers campaigning for better use of educational research? And Tom was asked, and 3 years later, the answer appears to be a resounding yes. And like all great institutions, Research Ed formalises a wider movement or culture change that has been taking place within education. Some classroom practice, which until 5 years ago was endemic in the profession, has been held up to scrutiny and found wanting. I've already mentioned brain gym, but alongside it we can place learning styles, multiple intelligences, discovery learning, and the 21st century skills movement as hollow shelves of their former selves. And that's not to say that such ideas are no longer at large within schools, far from it, but the intellectual underpinnings of such methods have been challenged, a vital first step in reversing the damage they've done. And what's so noticeable about this movement is that it's not emerged from our universities. Many university academics, it appeared, were too much invested in the status quo to provide any challenge. As Daisy Christodoulou just said, the entrenched power of conventional wisdom, I think, is alive and kicking in our universities. Rather, the challenge came from classroom teachers burning the midnight oil as they tweeted, blogged, and shared ideas about how to improve their profession. And according to the veteran teacher blogger Old Andrew, there are 1,237 active education blogs in the United Kingdom, and many of them, I can testify, have directly influenced government policy. Education provides a case study in the democratizing power of new media, providing an entry point for new voices to challenge old orthodoxies. And publishers have taken note. The bookshelves of any inquiring teacher have expanded significantly over the last few years. The titles of such books indicate the scale of the challenge to the prevailing education orthodoxies that is taking place. Teacher-proof. 7 myths about education. Progressively worse. What if everything you knew about education was wrong? Each book listed has been written by a classroom teacher, sending, in the words of one review, a heat-seeking missile to the heart of the education establishment. And this wellspring of free-thinking teachers convinces me that there's never been a better time to become a teacher than right now. The statistics are encouraging. In 2010, 61% of trainee teachers had an undergraduate degree at level 2-1 or above. And this year, that figure is 73%. And crucially, in 2012, the proportion of trainee teachers with a 2-1 or above surpassed the national average of that year's total graduating cohort for the first time. And the annual initial teacher training census shows us that the proportion of new teachers holding a first-class degree is at an all-time high. The best graduates today are going into teaching. Year on year, the prestige of the teaching profession is growing. And I recognise that it's a challenge to recruit new teachers in the context of a recovering economy and a strengthening graduate labour market. But the challenges we see in certain priority areas, such as physics, maths and languages, are not a new phenomenon. This year we've already exceeded our target for primary school teachers, and we're making sustained progress in the secondary sector, including subjects such as English, maths, physics and chemistry, where we are ahead of last year's performance. And contrary to the widely made claim that only 50% of teachers are teaching 5 years after qualifying, that figure is in fact 72%, a respectable figure for any profession. And our policy to make the EBAC compulsory from 2020 onwards has significant staffing implications for schools, and that's why we're developing new measures to meet them. At the end of last year, we pledged £67 million towards a scheme to recruit more maths and physics teachers for English schools. And I hope that today's trainee teachers are increasingly aware of evidence-based practice. But it remains important to ask why so many poor ideas were sustained for so long within schools. And to answer such a question, we mustn't forget the role played by central government. And to give just one example, in 2006, the Department of Children, Schools and Families, as it was then called, and we swiftly renamed, it formed the Teaching and Learning in 2020 Review Group, and their subsequent report, entitled 2020 Vision, threw its weight behind personalised learning. And it explained that as follows. Learners are active and curious. They create their own hypotheses, ask their own questions, coach one another, set goals for themselves, monitor their progress, and experiment with ideas for taking risks. And 2020 Vision suggested that the school of 2020 should pursue, and I quote, learning how to learn, themed project work, pupils working independently, and using ICT to enhance collaboration and creative learning. Lots of talk about learners learning, but almost nothing about teachers teaching. And in the same year that she wrote 2020 Vision, the chair of the 2020 Review Group became Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools. And the inspectorate became geared towards imposing its preferred teaching style on the profession. And research undertaken by the think tank Civitas last year revealed that as late as 2013, over half of Ofsted's secondary school inspection reports still showed a preference for pupils learning independent of teacher instruction. And nearly 1 in 5 reports criticised lessons where teachers talk too much. And this Ofsted teaching style directly contradicted the common sense of tens of hundreds of thousands of teachers, not to mention empirical evidence about effective teaching. And recently I was reminded of Ofsted's Reign of Error by David Didow's book. And buried in a footnote, he provides a remarkable anecdote about this period. And he writes, once in an exam analysis meeting, a school leader who taught in a particular department said that the reasons the exam results of that department were so poor was because of their outstanding teaching. They concentrated on independent learning and refused to spoon feed. This obviously meant kids did less well in the test. You don't have to be George Orwell to recognize the double think contained in that story, or the assault on the very meaning of the word outstanding that Ofsted created. For so many schools, the means of pupils working independently became more important than the ends of pupils actually learning. And we've worked with Ofsted to make sure that inspectors no longer penalise teachers who teach from the front. And Ofsted is continuing to reduce the burden that inspections place on schools. Ofsted guidance was reduced last year from 411 pages to 136 pages, and this year guidance has been further reduced despite the increased reach of the Common Inspection Framework. And from this month there will be shorter inspections every 3 years for schools already rated as good. And through their myth-busting document published last October, Ofsted are combating some of the myths surrounding inspection that still circulate the profession, such as the need to provide a written plan for every lesson. Ofsted have also sent a clear message that schools do not need to prepare for inspection and need only focus on helping pupils reach their full potential. And this is a message we fully support. 2020 Vision was just one example of the hundreds of reports churned out by a bloated panoply of quangos and ancillary bodies prior to 2010. Bector, the GTC, the NCSL, the SSAT, QCA, a whole industry of unfounded advice leading teachers up the garden path and towards the false dawn of informal teaching methods. Common amongst each of those bodies is that they all, since 2010, have either been disbanded, merged, or had their government funding curtailed. And this is because we believe that teachers teach best when government steps back. And here's one example. In 2005, the National Audit Office reported that the government had, from 1997, spent £885 million on measures to reduce truancy, during which period cases of unauthorised absence remained stable. The measures in question were classic cases of Whitehall knows best: attendance advisor support, national truancy sweeps, reward schemes, and alternative curricula adjusted to be more relevant to the interests of pupils. This government has not pursued these kinds of measures. The government made schools and parents more accountable for the attendance of their children, but we left it up to them to solve the problem. And as a result, the number of persistent absentees has almost halved, from 433,000 in 2010 to 233,000 in 2014. And this belief in autonomy explains why we've made academies and free schools a central component of our reform agenda. This government does not believe that all academies and free schools are necessarily better than maintained schools. But through granting unprecedented freedom to individual schools, we're creating an educational ecosystem in which new ideas can flourish, be it the emphasis on Russell Group universities pioneered by the London Academy of Excellence, or the remarkable teaching of King Solomon Academy, which is a school with over 60% of pupils on free school meals, has just achieved 93% A-star to C for the second year running, with an astonishing 75% of their pupils achieving the EBAC combination of GCSEs. School autonomy allows excellence to emerge, and such schools have startled the profession, setting new, higher expectations about what can be achieved within the state sector. School autonomy was not a government invention. In Lord Adonis's book, Education, 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 he recalls how encounters with ambitious and successful heads who wanted to replicate the success of their schools more widely, convinced him to pursue the Academy's programme. And Adonis mentions a meeting head teachers such as Kevin Satchwell at Thomas Telford and Sir Patrick Moynihan at Harris CTC, who 15 years later is in charge of a federation of 36 academies. They were and still are inspiring leaders who knew, if given the opportunity, they could transform our education system. The great Victorian constitutionalist Walter Bagehot wrote that policies must grow, they cannot be suddenly made. And this is true in the case of education, where our best policies have always grown out of the profession. Our emphasis on phonics, for example, would not have been possible without the work of individuals such as Ruth Miskin and teacher organisations such as the Reading Reform Foundation. And I look upon the next 5 years with great excitement, anticipating the new practices that will emerge due to greater school autonomy, which will in turn influence government policy, leading to a virtuous circle of innovation and improvement. The work of teachers has allowed the Education Endowment Foundation to make great strides since we founded the organisation in 2011. And to date, it has awarded, I keep being bleeped on my phone, so people are busy tweeting as we speak. So keep doing it, it's wonderful. To date, it has awarded £57 million to 100 projects, working with over 620,000 pupils in over 4,900 schools throughout England. It has published 45 individual project evaluation reports, all available to teachers for free online. The thirst for quality education research, which is so evident at this conference today, has begun to change how decisions are made within schools. And according to a poll commissioned by the Sutton Trust earlier this year, 48% of secondary school leaders and a third of primary school leaders now use the EEF teaching and learning toolkit when making decisions about classroom teaching. But there's still a long way to go. We created the EEF due to a belief that high-quality, robust research could empower classroom teachers, and I firmly believe it can. But teachers need to strive to make their voices heard. If anyone here still has to include learning styles in their lesson plans, please direct your senior leaders to Harold Pashler's comprehensive literature review, which lays bare the want of evidence to support learning styles. If you're criticised by colleagues for implementing frequent factual recall tests, so often characterised as mere regurgitation, please direct your colleagues towards the work of Robert Bjork, which shows that frequent testing strengthens long-term memory. And if your performance management is still based on termly do-or-die lesson observations, please direct your senior leaders to the work of Rob Coe, which shows such observations are not just stressful, but provenly imprecise. And if your school still practices brain gym, then God help you. Improving the quality of research is an easy first step. Converting such research into practice is a far greater challenge. But we should never see research as a panacea for all education's ills. At an event such as this, it is worth surveying the parameters of what research can actually achieve. The analogy between teaching and the medical professions, which Douglas Carnine and Ben Goldacre employ, shouldn't be stretched too far. Research can inform us about an effective means, but it can never decide for us what our ends should be. Within the medical profession, it's normally clear what the ends are. Keep the patient healthy, and where possible, keep the patient alive. But in education, this is not, nor should it be, a settled issue about what the purpose of school is. This is a passionate and sometimes fierce debate, which research may inform, but will never answer. And for this reason, I'm mistrustful of those who disdain lively debate and defer all opinion-making faculties to the omniscient being the evidence. The evidence provided by the EEF suggests that school uniform has no impact on pupils' performance. So should we abandon school uniform? I would argue no, because pupil performance is not the sole aim of a school. Fostering a collegiate ethos, preparing pupils for the world and for work, and ensuring no pupil feels inadequate through their clothing are all important ends in their own right. Through the reformed national curriculum and English literature GCSE, we have stipulated that every pupil should study at least 3 Shakespeare plays during their secondary school education. But what research attests to the benefit of studying Shakespeare? What research, for that matter, proves that pupils should know about diverse ecosystems, computer coding, or the Industrial Revolution? Such questions cut to the core of what it means to be an educated person. A question no number of effect sizes, meta-studies, or randomized controlled trials can answer. The many who disagree with our vision of an educated person have taken issue with this government's emphasis on the EBAC, which will be compulsory for all pupils entering secondary school this month. We believe that all children are entitled to learn a language and 3 sciences, that all children require a basic level of mathematics and English to thrive, and that all children should be initiated into the world through a study of either its history or its geography. Some in education don't share that belief. And I was reminded of such fundamental differences whilst watching the BBC documentary, Are Our Children Tough Enough? Chinese School. And in this documentary, 5 teachers from China taught 50 teenagers from an English school for 4 weeks. And this was no disadvantaged school in a deprived area of the country. It was an Ofsted outstanding school in the well-heeled rural town of Liphook in Hampshire. The Chinese teachers were shocked by the behaviour and attitude of the English children at the school. More worrying still, in my view, was the reaction of the school senior leadership to Chinese teaching methods. The evidence shows the effectiveness of Chinese teaching methods is unequivocal. According to the PISA tests, 15-year-old pupils in Shanghai are 3 years ahead of their English counterparts in mathematics. So whilst our pupils are in their first year of GCSE, Chinese pupils are doing A-level maths work. In mathematics, the children of the poorest 30% of Shanghai's population are outstripping the children of our wealthiest 10% in England. And one would think this would incline a head teacher to learn from the Chinese methods. Quite the opposite. The head teacher stated in the first episode, no educational approach or policy is going to turn back the British cultural clock to the 1950s, nor should it seek to. By the second episode, the head teacher criticised Chinese teaching as tedious and hoped the Chinese teachers in his school would fail and fail by a margin. As to him, they represented the dark ages of teaching. By the end of the third episode, a whole year examination had shown that pupils taught by Chinese teachers outperformed the control group in all 4 of the subjects studied. Yet the head teacher was still reluctant to acknowledge the advantages of Chinese teaching methods. Amongst some in the profession, a romantic aversion to formal teaching will forever trump the evidence which shows its effectiveness. For them, it will always be more important to have engaged pupils who are not learning than seemingly passive pupils who are. Like the 2 women Samuel Johnson famously witnessed screaming at each other from their windows across an alleyway, I fear they will never agree as they are arguing from different premises. One's most fundamental beliefs in education will ultimately always be informed by values. So let me set out what this government's values are. We believe that children across the country are entitled to a basic academic education up to at least the age of 16, because in the words of one of the teachers featured on Chinese School, knowledge changes one's destiny. We believe that all children should leave school with the skills that allow them to thrive in the workplace. We believe the most effective teaching methods should be pursued to achieve this, irrespective of whether some find them tedious. We believe that schools should be civilized and civilizing institutions which foster good character, because children do not always know best and sometimes require the benevolent authority of an adult. And lastly, we believe in a socially just Britain where the benefits of such an education are available to all, irrespective of background, ability, or birth. That's the vision that I and this government are dedicated to achieving. Research will guide us in the means by which these ends can be achieved, but ultimately it is teachers, and teachers alone, who will realise it. Thank you very much. Q&A?
Do you want to do a quick Q&A? Okay, we don't have a microphone down here, I'm
Or I
afraid.
could just read the tweets if you wish.
Up to yourself. Does anyone have a question they want to put to the Minister? Can I remind if I select? I'm going to start with gentleman there in the lovely t-shirt.
Thank you, Minister, for your remarks. Some of the things that I listened to I found very illuminating and very interesting. There were certain things you said that I felt myself nodding with, and there were other things you said that I felt myself really shaking my head. My question to you is, going right back to the start of your speech, you were celebrating the proportion of teachers who had a 2-1 and above. Myself, I have an ordinary degree. I got my PGCE the year before your policy came in that would have said I wouldn't be allowed to teach. There is no evidence to say that, or very little evidence to say that those people with a 2-1 or above make better teachers. And also, you're talking about a proportion where with the number of teachers at the moment has come down. So we're celebrating an increase of people with a higher degree level amongst a trainee cohort that has dropped incredibly, some would say, to a crisis level. In some subjects, such as physics, this has dropped from almost to where we needed it to be, right down.
Looking for a question mark here.
My question is coming now. Okay. Why is it that you're willing to make decisions like that that affect teacher numbers, and possibly you could improve teacher numbers by changing that policy, when teachers who do have, say, degrees with a lower level are able to spot errors in subject documents such as physics that get copied wholesale into exam documents? So, for example, the gravity constant.
Yes.
I just want to know why it is that you're willing to sacrifice a whole swathe of teachers who could be entering the profession just for the sake of having a 2-1 or above degree.
Thank you.
It's a very good question, and it allows me to I hope, kill a few myths. First of all, when we first introduced this sort of new higher thresholds for entering into the profession, the numbers of applications went up. Our objective, and no one is claiming that having a high level degree makes you a better teacher, any more than anyone should be claiming that having a low level degree makes you a better teacher. Better teachers are spread across the whole ability range of degree class. But if you look around the world and look at the most effective education jurisdictions in the world, they do recruit their graduates, their teachers, from the upper, if you like, group of graduates. And there are very few professions in the world that don't want to improve the recruits coming into their profession. So all we are trying to achieve is that objective, to get higher levels of graduates coming into the teaching profession. And the ultimate aim is to raise the status of teaching in this country, which I think is a worthwhile objective in its own right. Second point about recruitment. There is the vacancy rate amongst teaching at the moment is about less than 1%, and it has remained at that level since the year 2000. Now, no one should underestimate that we know there's a challenge, because we are in the midst of a very dynamic and successful economy. We have the highest growth rate now of any G7 country, and as a consequence, the competition for graduates has never been higher. So we are aware of the challenge. And we implement all sorts of measures, including very generous bursaries to attract maths graduates, physics graduates that you cited, foreign language graduates into the teaching profession. And we will do more of those things to ensure that we do everything we can to attract those graduates into teaching. Our long-term aim, is that if we can raise the status of the teaching profession, it will become significantly easier to continue to attract those graduates into the teaching profession. And that is our objective. So, and if you look at this time compared with last year, we are 3% ahead in terms of acceptances onto teacher training courses than we were a year ago. But I do know that there are challenges up and down the country in terms of recruiting math teachers, in terms of recruiting physics teachers. And we are doing everything we can. Last year we achieved 94% of our targets. I am continually pushing up the level of the targets because I know we need to recruit more teachers. So it will continue to be a challenge. We're rising to that challenge. But there isn't, as you cited, a crisis in teaching. There are just challenges that come from us living in a very dynamic and successful economy.
Thank you. Lily there, please.
Minister, thank you for that. I'm a London head teacher, just retired actually, now working for the Association of School and College Leaders. And our members certainly feel that there is a concern about teacher recruitment. Many of our members are unable to recruit sufficient teachers. And I'm interested to know how we might respond to the enormous gulf between what many people, school leaders, are experiencing on the ground with teacher recruitment and the evidence that is presented, for example, through Education Select Committee and so on, which suggests otherwise. Because at the moment we seem to be we have two different versions of reality. On the ground, head teachers, their deputies, school leaders are having to adjust their curriculum and ensure that they modify their timetables in view of the fact that there is such a shortage of teachers in so many key areas. But how might we come together to bridge that gulf so that our schools are full of teachers and we don't have such enormous vacancies on the ground?
Your objective is the same as our objective. And every time I hear comments like yours and comments like this, I go back to the department the next day and I challenge the evidence that I've been given. So look, you're telling me there's less than 1% vacancy rate. I'm being told in the system, by the sector, by head teachers, that there is a real difficulty in recruiting. And we have this dialogue. And of course we have to be led by what the evidence and the data tells us. Notwithstanding that, we are pushing up the targets. We've now removed any limits on universities and school direct recruiting subject to overall levels. So if people are finding, no physics graduate's going to be turned away from a teacher training college if they've got the ability and aptitude to be a teacher because of limits. There are no limits. So we are doing everything we can to recruit. So we are using every policy lever at our disposal to encourage people to come into teacher training and teaching. And we're also doing a lot to encourage returners to come into the teaching profession. The other thing people should realise is that only half of a year's new teachers come from teacher trainees. The other half comes from people returning to the profession or who've taken time out before starting teaching. So it's not as if we're sitting here saying, we don't think there's a problem, therefore we're not doing our best to recruit to the maximum. We are doing our best to recruit to the maximum. There are huge challenges because of having a dynamic economy. But every time I hear questions like that, it's very helpful, and I continue to challenge officials and the National College of Teaching and Leadership.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Sorry.
I'm Fergal Roche from The Key. Our survey last year, taken amongst 60,000 of our members who are all school leaders, said that the three main issues that they had was teacher morale, teacher workload, and tell us what works, which is why today is a great thing. And when we probe further on that, we find that so many teachers are frustrated by the whole game being changed. And they said, if the department were running football, halfway through the match, the offside rule would change, or the goalposts would move. And you talk a lot, Minister, about trying to professionalise the profession, give it more autonomy, give it more status. But where you keep changing the rules, surely we're not helping the profession in the way that we should be.
That's a very good question. And there have been a lot of changes over the last 5 years, and a lot of those changes that we have been debating and implementing are coming into effect now. It took us 5 years to get to the point where the new GCSEs in English and Maths start being taught this week. And next year, a whole raft of new GCSEs come on stream, and there'll be other GCSEs coming on stream in 2017, and the same applies to A-levels, 2015, 2016, 2017. So we're very aware that there has been a lot of change in the last 5 years, and a lot of changes developed in those last 5 years are now coming on stream. And the Secretary of State and I are very keen for there to be a period of stability during which we allow all those changes to embed. So that's point one. Point two, workload. We initiated the workload challenge. There were 44,000 responses to that workload challenge. At the top are things like data collection, the issue of deep marking, lesson planning, and so on. And we've taken each of these issues, and one of them is actually the lead time where implementation takes place. So we have introduced a minimum lead time for all changes, Ofsted frameworks, curriculum changes, which we are religious in adhering to. But those other issues I've talked about that really are, 56% said it was data collection. We've set up a working group to look at that. We've set up a working group to look at deep marking. We've set up a working group to look at the resources teachers have in order to prepare lessons. So hopefully all those working groups, made up of teachers and head teachers, will come up with recommendations that can further reduce the workload of teachers. And we've also swept away thousands of pages of regulation and guidance that teachers had to read and wade through in order to reduce that. And tell us what works, of course, that's what this is about. And we're going to be announcing some other issues and some other review groups looking at effective practice that will benefit the teaching profession. But thank you for your question.
Okay, that is bang on time. I'd like to thank everyone here for coming. Thank you very much for the fantastic questions. And also please thank the Minister for coming along and speaking to us. Thank you very much.